Hey yo, what a div, y'all. Let's get right into it. Now, games getting a sequel is always an occasion rife with excitement and questions, and we all know that Path of Exile 2 is definitely no exception to this. Now, at one point, one of the questions, even posed on this channel at one point, was why a sequel? But if you go far enough back, it's because PoE 2 is basically just a souped up PoE 1 version 4.0. That got canned because eventually PoE 2 became its own game entirely. And now, since early access release, there's been a lot of discussion on, what has been done both right and wrong. And so far, I think that one of the things that can be done is identified as one of the biggest strengths of the design, even if I think that there's a little bit of lack on the execution part of these designs, is the big swing that they took at fixing problems that they had in PoE 1. Which leads us to today's video topic. Let's talk about GDG's attempt at fixing the unfixable. But before we can dive into what these unfixable problems are, we need to define what makes something unfixable, right? Because intrinsically, there is no problem that is unfixable. Identifying something as a problem would mean that there's a better way to approach it, right? If you say something needs to be fixed, it implies that there is a better way to do it, because this current situation sucks. And so, unfixable here refers to problems with the game that fall into one of the following categories. It's either too core to the game's current identity, or the game's technical limitations currently just prevent you from going above and beyond, or you need to redo something at a base level, which now it does sound like when I say too core to the game's identity or redoing the gameplay at the base level, they sound very similar, but I need to specify they actually do have a very meaningful difference in the fact that identity is something that the players have attached onto versus gameplay design, and the redoing that at its base level refers to things that are the intentions and plans of the developers. Now, before we fully launch into everything about this topic, I do need to let you know that I don't think this list is entirely exhaustive or specific enough, quite frankly, but it opens up the conversation and gave me a bit of a framework to finally begin this conversation, because it's been on my mind since the stream announcing that PoE 2's early access was going to be taking place last year, right? Once we had all that information, it's been on my mind ever since. And I'm glad that I'm finally able to talk about it now that I've thought my thoughts through and the early access taking its course. But if you guys want to, I would much appreciate it if you would, offer up more categories or more things that belong within these categories, down in the comments. And while you're at it, you should subscribe, just to support the channel. Why not, right? Now, let's begin looking at these categories. Damage conversion is a fairly unique mechanic in Path of Exile 1. It's a particularly intricate interaction in which your outgoing damage is converted down a very specific order of damage types, right? Physical, lightning, cold, fire, chaos. Guaranteed in that order. And it refers to both terms that you may have seen in game as either gains your damage as an extra damage type, or converts your damage from one type to the next. And it always, again, goes down this line, that order. Now, this on its own is nothing particularly special, but combine this with the fact that your damage is then also scaled both before and after conversion, and you start to see what makes this mechanic so special. Now, allow me to demonstrate how insane this can really be. Let's imagine a skill with the base damage of 100, but it also naturally converts 60% of its damage to lightning. And now we can add in the lightning mastery that will convert 40% of your physical damage to lightning. This is 100% conversion to lightning, and therefore all 100 of our physical damage is now lightning damage. We need one more step of conversion though in order to really start to highlight what makes this ridiculous. So we're going to add in 220 quality called the Brotherhoods in order to have this be 96% lightning damage to cold damage. So now we have 4 lightning damage and 96 cold damage. And it's time to start talking about what makes this ridiculous. We're going to use the notable Stormweaver as our baseline for this understanding, as it is relatively easy to understand what's happening in this particular example, and then we'll extrapolate this to all of the other use cases. Now, if you look at Stormweaver, the important thing of note is that the increase to cold damage and the increase to lightning damage are on separate lines, right? It's not one line that says 25% increased cold and lightning damage. It is 25% increased cold damage, line break, 25% increased lightning damage. And what this means is that the game will read each line to see if it's relevant for the character in question. So, if we didn't have the 2 Call of the Brotherhoods equipped, we would have just 100 lightning damage, and that would be affected by 25% increased lightning damage, and as such would be 100 times 1.25 or 125 lightning damage. Now, imagine with the Call of the Brotherhoods on. In your head, without knowledge of how conversion in PoE works, you might think that it's just, okay, so the 4 lightning damage remaining is multiplied by 1.25 for the 25% lightning damage, and the 96 cold damage is multiplied by 1.25 for the cold damage. And that works that way everywhere else but in Path of Exile 1. Path of Exile 1, your damage is scaled ahead of time as well. The damage was once upon a time lightning damage, right? That 96 cold damage was also 96 lightning damage. And so it says, oh, well, I'm also going to get scaled by the lightning damage, which means that the 96 cold damage is scaled by 25% increased lightning and 25% increased cold, or a total of 50% increased damage. So you do have the 4 times 1.25 as identified earlier, but 96 is actually being multiplied by 1.5 instead. And so now you have a total of 149 damage on the scale as opposed to 125 damage on the scale, which is almost a 20% damage increase. Now, this is exaggerated in this particular example because you usually have a lot more percent increased damage on your character anyways, but this is just to give you the idea of how the double dipping that you may have heard of about conversion in Path of Exile 1 worked. And there are some places where it's much more potent, right? Think about Hatred and Herald of Ash. Before the recent changes, they provided 2 different effects on separate lines. A damage gained as for physical to their respective elements, so cold for Hatred or fire for Ash, as well as a percentage damage more modifier. It had both of these, right? So now imagine a world where your character is able to benefit from Wrath because it was once lightning damage, but then it got converted to cold damage via Call of the Brotherhoods, and it also then scaled with Hatred. This is what made conversion so insane. And now that you've started to really see and understand this, or maybe you already knew this and you're just listening because you're curious how I explained it, the question becomes, how do you balance a skill that is scaled in this manner? And now, you might think this is not the hardest problem to solve. Just find ways to design conversion exclusive damage bonuses. But that's not particularly fun. It begins to feel like you're playing whack-a-mole against the player. And it tried to find different ways to do that, but it is just kind of, again, whack-a-mole against the player. And so, as such, this problem just runs rampant. But what if you just nerf the conversion numbers? Maybe instead of 100% conversion on something like Grim Sorrows, for example, it's now 50% conversion, and you just halve all the conversion numbers. All you would end up with is people either abandoning conversion because of how strong single element is, or really Trinity scaling is also extremely strong, so maybe there's an option there, or they would just have to invest harder in getting to 100% conversion to leverage the mechanic effectively. So you still haven't actually got rid of the problem. You're just making it harder to leverage the strength of the problem, which I guess technically works. So again, back to the question, right, for this section. How do you balance a skill that can be scaled through conversion? And the best answer that it felt like GDG had is just balance the skill as if it were always going to be converted. Your skill's ceilings and floors were determined based on their conversion levels of output. A skill like Penance Brand is not scaled, balanced, and tuned as a physical to lightning skill. It is understood that it will be equipped with Call of the Brotherhoods, and then it might even go to a fire step, right? Or if you're old enough, the Eternity Shroud days, right? You just assume that these skills will be converted and factor that in. Now, it's not the worst solution, but it does damage any other way of playing the build totally. And so, as such, enter PoE 2. Because at ExileCon 2023, they mentioned that conversion was now going to function in a much more intuitive way. That first way that I mentioned, where converted damage will only care about what it's actually being, right? The final damage types it deals, which removes this layering of damage modifiers problem at the cost of a very core to the heart, so the player base's mechanic. This removal of a notorious beloved mechanic in your game is a fantastic reason to move that fix from game 1 to game 2, right? Imagine opening patch notes for, say, Path of Exile 4.0 update, right? We're still in PoE 1, 4.0 is coming out. And you find out that conversion as a mechanic has been changed to Path of Exile 2's version of conversion. Well, first of all, we'd be in heaven because Path of Exile 1 will be getting updates. But more importantly, it's just that this change is going to feel weird. It's not that I think they would misbalance it. It's just that it would feel wrong to have lost something that felt almost intended, even though it's confirmed from many, many years ago to be a bug. It was just a thing that the community came to know and love about the jank of our favorite game. One of the worst feelings in Path of Exile, just currently, is things that feel janky because the game is old, right? We love our old games around here, but we also know that there's a lot of jank or just things that can't be really done in Path of Exile 1 because of how old the game is, right? The game came out over a decade ago. There are just things that are just too old to easily be redone. Just think about how, like, for example, animations for abilities work. If you ever like looked at a caster using their skills, for example, it's not the same, right? Look between Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2 and the difference in the animations used even for the same skills. Look at how much better the modeling and the rigging is for these abilities. And it's not just in animations that you will see these types of improvements, right? If you look at skill effects, world design, details around like in the zones themselves, the cities, the menus, there are a lot of simple visual improvements that aren't necessarily gameplay impacting always, but definitely improve sentiment referring to the game. Because, honestly, let's be real for a second. If somebody tried to introduce you to a game that looked too old nowadays, you would be like, I don't know. Or maybe you're like, this is awesome because it reminds me of but like that's a part of the charm, right? But for most people, the game looking like it's dated is not a good thing. Or sometimes feeling like it's dated. And we all remember, or maybe you don't remember, but let me tell you, Delirium in Path of Exile 1 has always been a nightmare, right? Even on the highest end of PCs, nothing quite like when Empyrean upgraded his computer only to still receive time dilation in his 6-man mapping content. And that 6-man mapping content is extreme, but just the understanding that the game has always struggled with how high the ceilings of the game can really get in terms of the amount of monsters and loot that need to be rendered. Now, here's the thing. We look at PoE 2, and some of these improvements in this aspect still need more work or optimization, but it's very obvious that the work made them better, right? Even with something as annoying as the comet animation, it's worth noting that it does look really good. It's very thematic. It just makes you wonder why you bothered pressing comment, honestly. But you got to see this far more beautiful, elegant, and unique animation to that skill. Instead of just being generic caster animation number 1, number 3, number 7. But as with the theme of this video, we have to ask, is it better that this was done in Path of Exile 2 instead of Path of Exile 1? No. Just flat out no. Because this could have been done in PoE 1, right? They could have re-rigged the entirety of PoE 1. They could have done all of the, graphical updates. Just again, please, not the comment animation thing. I do not need skills with that type of animation, but that's not a graphical thing, right? That's a game design thing. They decided to make that skill slow so they could give it a cool animation. Now, to be fair to GGG, I'm very aware that upgrading games in that type of form is extremely difficult, right? You end up having to navigate old code as well as potentially even upgrade engines, which I'm very aware that upgrading from engine to engine is a nightmare. But I do still stand on the statement that it was not actually an unfixable problem in Path of Exile 1. It just happened to be far more convenient to have it happen in Path of Exile 2 because from conversations before Path of Exile 2's like split from Path of Exile 1, we were going to just get these changes in Path of Exile 1 anyways, right? It just would have been potentially more work. Who knows? The two examples of strides made by the game that I've been provided so far allow us to get a glimpse into what I meant earlier when I said that some changes do in fact make sense to be pushed down into a sequel rather than a game update. Conversion is a simple enough example of just a core mechanic that could be redone in Path of Exile 1, but it's just damaging player experiences in hopes that the game will draw in more players due to reduced complexity and that the game can be balanced better. But it still hurts experiences that already exist, right? Now, comparatively, the technical improvements made are definitely things that could just go into Path of Exile 1, but could very easily be a little bit too complicated to implement, at least easily, quickly, or efficiently. But there was a third thing that I mentioned, and I think this is the most important type of change to make going forward into a sequel: evolution of gameplay. When talking about overhauling an entire system that the game is built around, it could easily go either way on whether it should be a big patch in the history of the game or the catalyst for a new game altogether. How do you make the decision that it should actually be one or the other? One way to help make this decision is to ask whether or not the change is actually going to inspire a new way to play your game entirely. If the system in question is just a large enough change to change how the game is played altogether, it can be marketed heavily as a huge step forward for the game. As well as honestly just making sure that the players don't feel like they're just paying for a second version of a game they've already paid and played for. Ignore the fact that Path of Exile 1 is technically a free game. You get what I mean. Now, what's interesting about this criteria on its own is that we could have already met this multiple times in Path of Exile's history, but they just go down as major patches such as yearly expansions or full version updates. In fact, Path of Exile has had 11 updates since its full release in 1.0. That's why I'm considering its full release. That can be labeled as major releases, all of which substantially shook up how the game was played. There's a catch though. All of these changes are designed to be added on top of what had already existed. For example, Betrayal's large expansion was a full redesign of the Forsaken Master system that predated it by over 4 years at that point. Or you can look at the insane update to the Atlas system that we got in Conquerors of the Atlas, which completely redid endgame progression, but did not actually add or it changed maps that in the game at all outside of that. So it's not just that the changes need to be large, because everything I named was considered huge and game-changing at the time of their release, but it is still Path of Exile 1. That same game that we always knew and loved, and we were just adding more tools to the toolbox and more features on top of features. The changes need to actually be the groundwork for the game's design in order to stand out as a feature of a new game. Now, what if a part of the game actually did change in a way that you had to learn pretty much every aspect of the game again from top to bottom because of it? What if that system changed in a way that is only recognizable to its original version because of terminology? And what if that system is in fact the backbone of the game's combat? I feel like I'm doing a sales pitch. I'm not trying to sell you this game. I'm just telling you that a system does in fact fit these terms. The gem changes in Path of Exile too. Now, you might be thinking that can't really be the case because there's so many of our original skills already back in the game, like Spark and Flame Wall. That's not a system thing, right? That's just cogs in a structure. It's pretty easy to, just make the skill that people already loved again. But that's not the gem system. Zoom out a little bit, right? Look at the entire system. Look at how much of the game has been refaced entirely because of the changes to the gem system. Currencies were removed or changed in functionality because of it, right? We went from linked gear to linked gems, and it changed what Jeweler's Orbs and Orbs of Fusings are, right? Power of given skills has been changed quite a lot to understand that they are, in fact, able to be supported regardless of other things being supported, at least on the high end, right? The combat has idealistically moved into a state in which you are using and weaving multiple skills together to achieve their goals. Sometimes even having a specific skill set up for single target and a different skill set up for mobbing, right? The acquisition of gems, both the supports and the skills themselves, has substantially changed. The leveling of them has changed. The gem system change as a whole completely redefined a section of how we play Path of Exile. It's not sockets in our gear anymore. It's sockets in the gems. There's a limit on the usage of numbers of supports that we can use for things, right? Which is lame on its own, but now we have an ascendancy based around interacting with that system, right? This entire redesign really changes Path of Exile into Path of Exile 2, or is at least one of the major components that does so, and is worthy of being included in a system because it does make the game fundamentally different. Now, as I said before, this list is far from exhaustive because I can already think of one topic that you were probably thinking would have been in this video, which is crafting. And honestly, it's just because that topic has been beaten to death, whether it might be by other people or even just by myself on this channel. And I feel like it needs its own video if I really wanted to include it in a discussion like this, because it is a huge change, but it's more in the way that conversion would have been is changed and not in the way that gems were changed, right? But it's in a bucket already that I got to talk about. But there are so many changes that happened in PoE 1 to PoE 2's transition, right? And that makes it impossible to make this list exhaustive. A sequel isn't just a place to fix trouble systems that have been a thorn in your side for a long period of time as a developer, right? Not in live service games, anyways, which is why this video exists and why we were always wondering, why do we really need a sequel? Why sequels are always such a hit or miss idea, right? You replace the need for marketing budgets and presentations, but instead just doing things in live service games to try to reduce churn and fulfill needs within the game anyways. And to really justify a sequel in this world, you need a myriad of changes that fall into these quote unfixable buckets that we talked about earlier. The changes that are just things that players identify with. Changes that are things that honestly would just be too difficult to incorporate because of engine limitations or whatever that may be on a technical level, or things that just allow you to completely redo the backbone of your game at its core. With changes that really push these limits, that's what makes a sequel really be a sequel. It really makes it an evolution of gameplay instead of just a second version of the first game. Now, as I finish up here, I just have to ask you one question. Is any problem in a game ever truly unfixable? Let me know down below. Thank you guys for watching and listening. Hope to see you in the next one. Peace.